3. The title of today's episode is Conservatism and Autopsy. And I'd like to welcome also everyone who's watching via live stream. I'm streaming right now live to Facebook and to Twitter and to YouTube. So welcome to those of you who are watching this live. Well, I'd be tempted to say I hope everybody had a good week this week, but I don't know. Somehow that just doesn't seem very adequate or very appropriate given the events that have gone on this past week. And of course, I'm referring to two things in particular: the elections that were held on Tuesday, the January the 6th or 5th rather, and the fact that you had a couple of pretty hardcore liberal Democrats who were elected in Georgia, and then you had the disastrous Trump rally the very next day on the 6th in Washington, D.C. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, and I want to focus in particular on the events on Wednesday, because when I saw what was going on there, I just my heart sank. It really did. I mean, I looked at it and it was pretty evident that was just about the worst possible thing that could have happened. And I guess a few things. Maybe what I would want to start off with is just by saying, that those people who rushed the Capitol, they shouldn't have done that. And those who did do that, well, they're going to be punished, and they will be justly punished. And I don't have any argument with that. That's as it should be. But what troubled me was the most about all of it is what the fallout is going to be as a result of that, because it's not going to just be a few perpetrators who here and there who get punished, but there are going to be some major consequences for Republicans, for conservatives, for anybody who's a Trump reporter, for anybody who really, what I would call themselves is an American patriot. I think that there are going to be some very serious repercussions, and I mean, we were going to have a tough time under a Biden presidency anyway, but with this, it's just it gives them an opportunity to have the moral high ground to take some steps that I don't think they otherwise would be able to do. Now, one thing, and there were, I've had a chance to do some reading and do some thinking about this the past few days. I haven't really commented on the events of Wednesday, and I kind of wanted to avoid doing that, because sometimes it's easy to give a hot take, and then you come back a little bit later and you say, oh, well, maybe I need to correct some things that I said. So I wanted to take some time to think about it, to read about it, to have some time to ponder it, turn it over in my mind a little bit. One of the interesting takes that I found on the violence at the Wednesday rally actually came from Dr. Ron Paul from the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Now, if you don't watch the Ron Paul Liberty Report, do so. You have to do this. It's one of the. I mean, if you're someone who loves limited government, sound money, liberty, freedom, these kinds of things, you got to be a part of the Ron Paul Liberty Report. It's one of the best programs that you find anywhere on the internet. He broadcasts every day live at noon Eastern time on YouTube, but he's also puts his work out on a number of other venues. I believe they're on BitChute for one, and they may be on some others. They're also on Parler as well, so that's another place where you can get the Ron Paul Liberty Report feed. They're also, of course, on Twitter. But the way things are going, you wonder how much longer they're going to be on YouTube. And in fact, it was interesting during the discussion. This was the program from Thursday, and I'm going to put a link to that program in the show notes. His co-host, Daniel McAdams, made the point that they are currently under scrutiny with YouTube. So, I mean, it's possible they could be gone at any time. And the way things are going right now, it wouldn't surprise me, because, there have been some massive purges of conservatives on some of the big big social media channels, especially platforms rather, especially Twitter seems to be very active in this regard. They banned the president. They even banned Rush Limbaugh. I think who's only been on Twitter for maybe 2 or 3 months now. And of course, if they can ban the president and they can ban Rush Limbaugh, well, they can ban pretty much anybody they want to, including you and me. So anyway, I would really encourage you to sign up for the Ron Paul Liberty Report. I think it's an outstanding program. And it was interesting to listen to Ron Paul and Daniel McAdams discuss the events on Thursdays. And one of the things that they put forward is they floated the idea that some of what went on there may not have been what it appears. One of the points that they made was, there have been maybe dozens, maybe I don't know how many Trump rallies there have been over, since 2015 up until the present, but there have been a lot of them. And to my knowledge, to their knowledge, I don't think there's ever been any serious violence ever attributed to Trump supporters. Now, there have been Trump supporters who've been violently attacked. There's lots of videos from that from 2016, but there isn't video of Trump supporters carrying out acts of violence. Now, myself, I've been to Trump rallies on 3 occasions. I saw Donald Trump twice. I saw him once in October of 2016. Now, that was actually during the presidential election. And I saw him again a couple months later in December of 2016 after he won. He came back into town, and he was doing a thank you tour rallies in a number of cities. So anyway, he came in December of 2016. And then I also saw him again in October of 2018 when he came into the area. He was doing a rally for, it was for the midterm congressional elections. And in all 3 cases, I went to these rallies. You didn't find people who were a lot of crazies, violent people. They were just normal people. They're just normal American people who were, people who worked the jobs and took care of their families, and they didn't have a third eyeball in the middle of their forehead. They weren't a bunch of crazies. They were just regular Americans who came out to support Donald Trump. They were completely peaceful rallies. And this is one of the points that Ron Paul and Daniel McAdams made. And the fact that you had so much violence all of a sudden break out at this, well, you have to ask yourself, some people have been saying, well, that there were some agent provocateurs, that there were people there who had infiltrated the rally with the idea of carrying out violence. Now, I don't have any proof that took place other than to try to kind of think through some of the events that happened. And again, you're looking at a case that, as far as I'm aware, there's no other Trump rally where you've seen violence out of the Trump supporters. Now, you could explain that in other ways, but there were additional things too that they brought up, and I would encourage you to watch the video. I think it's pretty interesting. And by the way, by saying that there were the possibility that there were infiltrators among the pro-Trump crowd that instigated some of this, that doesn't let people off the hook for doing the things that they did. I mean, if somebody went into the Capitol, if somebody smashed up stuff, if somebody carried out acts of vandalism or violence or this type of thing, well, I mean, those people deserve to be punished. Whether they, regardless of what the reasons were that they were carrying that out. I don't support that kind of thing. And the other thing is, I don't think that most people who are Trump supporters would countenance that type of thing. But I mean, one of the things that really bothered me about that entire episode, though, was that in looking at, I just knew as soon as I saw that there were going to be serious repercussions, not only for Donald Trump, but also for those people who were his supporters. Oh, and by the way, before I move on here, I wanted to mention there's another article that I found that discussed the possibility of infiltration in the Trump rally. It's written by a fellow named Stephen Lenman. Now, he's an old school leftist. I mean, he's not a conservative. He's not a Republican. But he actually talks in here about some things that he believes that indicates that the rally may have been infiltrated. And the fact that he is a liberal, that actually makes his case a bit stronger. I'm going to put that link in the show notes as well. I think you might find that interesting. So, what were the fallout of some of the things? I mentioned I was very concerned about what went on Wednesday on the 6th with all the happenings at the Capitol. Well, it didn't take long for all my fears to be realized. Twitter, for instance, permanently banned Donald Trump. His at real Donald Trump account is gone. He can't post on that anymore. And I think they've removed all of his tweets as well. I think I went and I checked that yesterday, and it's all shut down. And a number of his supporters have been shut down as well. Very prominent people have been kicked off of Twitter. Among them, probably the biggest name on that was Rush Limbaugh. I mean, Rush Limbaugh has been an absolute bedrock Republican advocate, conservative, public personality for over 30 years. I started listening to Rush Limbaugh in the late 80s. Okay. I mean, he's been doing this a long time, and he's kind of considered mainstream. I mean, he certainly is a veteran. I mean, he received, in fact, that the State of the Union address, he was given an award by Donald Trump. I can't remember the exact award that he got, but anyway, he's a very prominent guy. I mean, he's been around for literally for decades, and yet he can't stay on Twitter because I guess he said something that he apparently shouldn't have said in the eyes of the technocrats that now seem to run our country. So you've got increased banning on social media. Of course, this has been going on now for over 2 years now, and even longer than that. It probably goes back 4 years, but it really started in earnest in August of 2008 when they banned Alex Jones. And it's just continued that way along those lines ever since. Now, one thing's for sure is by banning Donald Trump, that tells you something about where the real power in this nation lies. It doesn't lie with the elected officials. I mean, if social media companies are able to ban a sitting president of the United States, well, they can ban any other public official as well. And they can certainly ban you and me. I mean, we don't have anything remotely like the kind of power and influence of a president. So, I mean, it really kind of suggests that the public officials, the elected officials of the United States of America, aren't really calling the shots. That's a big problem. One of the other things that came out of the violence on Wednesday was calls to remove Trump from office. Now, there have been some people who've called for invoking the 25th Amendment. Now, if you're not familiar with the 25th Amendment, that's basically an amendment that says if a president becomes incapacitated in the judgment of, mentally incapacitated in the judgment of, the cabinet, that he can be removed. Now, the vice president actually has to give his okay to sign off on that whole thing. And Mike Pence has said he's not going to do that. So that's probably not going to happen. That's probably not going to happen. You're probably not going to see the 25th Amendment invoked. On the other hand, there are calls for impeachment. And it's actually quite amazing how vociferous the Democrats have been when it comes to trying to impeach Donald Trump. And here's an article. I'm going to see if I can do a screen share here. Just a moment. Let's see. Here we go. Yeah. Now here's an article. This is from a liberal website called Vox, and it's got a headline that says, "Will Trump be impeached or face removal under the 25th Amendment?" And they talk here a little bit about politicians are increasingly considering whether to take against Donald Trump or take action against Donald Trump before his term in office expires on January 20th. In the wake of Wednesday's presidentially incited chaos at the Capitol. Well, I don't know that it actually was presidentially incited. I believe Donald Trump, and I didn't see the speech, but I've heard people talk about it, and he told them, I believe, that they were to go to the Capitol and that they were going to protest peacefully. And I think he explicitly said that when he was giving his speech. So no, I don't know that you can say that it was presidentially incited. But this is Vox, and I mean, then Vox, as does most of the media, is going to put the worst possible construction on anything that Donald Trump says. But they talk in here about the possibility of the 25th Amendment. And also they talk about the possibility, if that doesn't work, that they're going to impeach him, or that that's what they claim they're going to do. Um, and all this is going on here with what's this? I'm recording this. It's about 11:30 on Saturday, January the 9th. Well, his term ends on January the 20th, so we're talking here 11 days from now. But they can't seem to wait. He's got to get out of office now. Now, of course, some people, this has raised some questions in some people. Okay, in some people's minds. Okay, so why are they so desperate to get rid of him? And this is one of the things that Ron Paul and Daniel McAdams discussed on their program from last Thursday. Yeah, and it kind of makes you, they seem like they're afraid of something. And, various people have floated ideas about what that might be. They're concerned that maybe Donald Trump might declassify some documents that might show maybe some criminal activity on the part of certain people that don't want that criminal activity exposed. I don't know. I mean, that is a possibility. So we'll have to wait and see. I think there's a very good chance that the next week and a half could be very interesting, and maybe we'll be discussing some of that this time next week. I don't know. We'll see. Another bit of fallout from the rally violence on Wednesday. Tucker Carlson made this point in his show, and he said this. He said that the people coming to power, they actually want to hurt their political opponents, and they're going to use Tuesday's, they're going to use the events that took place on Wednesday as justification for doing that. There was a journalist by the name of Rick Klein. Now, Rick Klein is not a nobody. Rick Klein is the political director of ABC News, so he's a big shot. He's a big shot mainstream media guy, and he wrote a column. I think it may have been on Wednesday, it may have been on Thursday, not long, I think, after the events at the Capitol. And this is what he wrote: "Quote, even aside from impeachment and 25th Amendment, Trump will be an ex-president in 13 days. The fact is that getting rid of Trump is the easy part. Cleansing the movement he commands, or getting rid of what he represents to so many Americans, is going to be something else." Now get a load of that language he used. Cleansing the movement he commands. Now, what does that mean exactly? I think he got some heat for that, and in fact, that's the original wording on it. If you go back and you read, there was another edition put out. Maybe it was a few hours later. I don't know, but it softened the language on it a bit. But nevertheless, Rick Klein wrote what he wrote. That was his original wording. He's talking about cleansing the movement. Now, I mean, that sounds like something that you would expect out of some leftist dictatorship. We're going to have a political cleansing. And that has some very nasty overtones to it. And this isn't coming from an obscure guy either. This is coming from a very prominent fellow. Now, there was another piece. In fact, this was a piece that was, it's not by Glenn Greenwald, but it was written about him. And maybe I'll go ahead and share that particular piece as well here on screen. Just a moment. Let me get that done here. Yeah, there's a piece that appeared, and this was on the website RT, and it's got a headline: "Media and Democrats are launching second war on terror against Americans, Glenn Greenwald warns." So what they're going to do is they're going to use the events that took place on Wednesday to say, oh, well, we need a new war on terror, but this time it's going to be directed domestically as opposed to abroad. And read a little bit of this here. It says, some of the very same people behind the original war on terror are now helping to start a new one against Americans, journalist Glenn Greenwald warned, amid a rising crackdown on free speech following the chaos at the U.S. Capitol. Now, again, Glenn Greenwald is, he's not a conservative partisan. He's pretty much straight down the middle. I mean, he's not, I wouldn't say he's somebody that, he maybe leans a little bit liberal, I don't know, but he's a good journalist. And I've read his work over the years, and he's somebody whose analysis I trust. And here's a tweet that he put out. This is in the article. He says, "There's absolutely a new war on terror being initiated. It had been lurking for a while, but it's accelerating now for obvious reasons. The new one is aimed inward, domestically. It entails many of the same frameworks." They're saying it explicitly. And he has a quote here from the Wall Street Journal, and he has a highlight here. He says, "Mr. Biden said that he plans to make a priority of passing a law against domestic terrorism." And again, this is all in response to the events from Wednesday, January the 6th. And he says, "I spent the first decade of my journalism career devoted to exposing and denouncing the excesses of the first war on terror, and I see exactly the same tactics forming. The Democrats behind it won't even need to study the tactics of neoconservatives from the original war on terror, as neocons are their full allies in all this," Greenwald noted. "Anyone who has questions or concerns about it will be demonized as a terrorist sympathizer." So if you say, hey, pushing all of this domestic war on terror, aren't you maybe, isn't that getting a little scary? Isn't that getting a little bit like a dictatorship? And of course, people, the supporters of this new domestic war on terror are just going to say, well, the only reason you're saying that is because you're a terrorist sympathizer. And he cites a fellow by the name of David Frum. Now, David Frum is a very prominent, I guess you call him a neoconservative, writer, intellectual. He's probably best known to the American public back during the original war on terror. He talked about the axes of evil. You might remember that particular turn of phrase from back, I guess it was in 2003, in the run-up to the war in Iraq. And so he's very well known for that. He was a speechwriter, actually, for the Bush administration. But now, he's out there criticizing, say, Tucker Carlson for bringing up the risk that is the genuine risk that people who are, say, Trump supporters, conservatives, what have you, are facing as a result of the activities that took place on Wednesday. And he talks about these conservatives. In fact, he even brings up Glenn Greenwald's name. He says they, talking about the conservatives or others who are criticizing the second war on terror. He says they lament the real victims of the attempted violent overthrow of a U.S. election will be those who sympathized with that attempted violent overthrow. So here they are. There, he's saying that that the people who, that is, David Frum is saying that people like Tucker Carlson and Glenn Greenwald are lamenting that the victims of the attempted overthrow will be those who sympathized with that overthrow. So David Frum thinks it's all well and good to go after, and he doesn't quite come out and just say Trump supporters in general, but you kind of get a sense that's who he's talking about here. So anyway, and here's another one. There's CNN. This is a tweet here by Tom Allett. He says, now CNN's Oliver Darcy is going after cable companies for carrying Fox News. And apparently they're also going after cable companies for carrying other conservative political outlets. So, I mean, the censorship is increasing. It's not getting less. It's not getting better. This is something that's becoming consistently worse. The First Amendment, the idea of free speech, is definitely under attack. Now, let's take a look here. The question, of course, and I think one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves, of course, is how did we get here? How on earth did we, the United States, get into this position? And in my view, the bottom line with the loss of the presidential election, the loss of the Senate, the aggressive discrediting of patriotic Americans by the mainstream media, by major corporations, by the schools, by the universities, by the entertainment industry, in other words, pretty much by the entire American establishment. I think perhaps it's time that we Protestants started asking ourselves where we went wrong. Where did we go wrong? The prospects of our nation are not getting better. I mean, back in the day, I remember growing up, and this was maybe in the late 70s, early 80s, there was always this talk about the evangelical right or the religious right. Well, nobody even talks about that anymore. There were organizations such as the Moral Majority, and that was with it was headed up by Jerry Falwell. There were others, but that was one particular prominent one. But it doesn't seem that Protestants have any influence about what goes on in this country at all anymore. And not only in our country, it's not getting better. I mean, things are not getting better. The moral climate of the country isn't better. The political situation isn't getting better. We're not becoming more free. We're becoming less free. We're not shrinking government. I mean, that used to be something that conservatives at least used to pretend that they supported. But government's not shrinking. Government's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, just think about what happened here, within the past year, and say in 2020. There have been a number of financial commentators have pointed out that about 25% of the dollar currency units that have ever been created in the history of the country were created in 2020. 25%. Now that's an extraordinary amount. I mean, that tells you how fast government is growing, how big it's getting. So it's not getting better. We like to tell ourselves, we spend all this time, we spend all this money, and we're improving the moral climate of the country. Well, it's not improving. I mean, I can tell you this just in my own experience here locally where I live. I mean, I live in the greater Cincinnati area in Hamilton County. Now, when I was growing up, Hamilton County was a Republican bastion, famously so. I mean, it was known that way. It was one of the really Republican-leaning counties in the state of Ohio. Ohio's kind of interesting that way because Ohio, if you go up north, say into the Cleveland area, that's a much more Democrat area, and it historically has been. But if you live in this part of the state, in southern Ohio, and in Cincinnati is in southwest Ohio, Hamilton County is in extreme southwest Ohio. Hamilton County is where Cincinnati is located. We're actually right. I mean, if you look at a map of Ohio, we're as far southwest as you can get in Ohio. We border Indiana on the west side and Kentucky on the south. And this part of the state is actually historically very Republican. But Hamilton County no longer is. Hamilton County's gone Democrat. And now the surrounding areas around Cincinnati are still very Republican, but Hamilton County no longer is. And in fact, just to kind of prove to you what I'm talking about, Hamilton County just, I don't know what the right word is, installed or swore in or what have you, a new sheriff. And the sheriff she's a lesbian. Now, it would have been unthinkable, oh goodness, even just a few years ago, to see Hamilton County with a Democrat lesbian sheriff. But that's what we have now, and that's what the voter base of Hamilton County has become. And that was never the case when I was growing up. I mean, I think even 5 or 10 years ago that would have been unthinkable, but that's what it is now, and it doesn't seem to be any stopping of that, despite all the conservatives and Republicans and the money spent in campaigns and all of this other stuff. There was a tweet that I saw this past week I thought was very telling. And it was by a fellow named Dave Weigel. He's a political reporter for the Washington Post. So again, he's a prominent guy. He's one of the blue checkers on Twitter. If you go on Twitter, you got these special people with the blue check mark next to their name, and that means they're verified. It means they're kind of a big shot, and they're typically people who are, prominent politicians or prominent journalists, things of this sort. And Dave Weigel is somebody who's he's a writer for the Washington Post. And this is what Dave Weigel said. He said that, and this was on January 6th, he said, Protestants locked out of the top offices for the first time ever. And by top offices, he expands on it. He means things, he means president, chief justice, speaker of the House, majority leader. Now, I suppose maybe you could argue, say, well, Kamala Harris is a Protestant. Well, maybe in some nominal sense, I think she's a Baptist, but she's not a Christian, and I think that's very obvious from the comments she makes and from the policies that she supports. No, she's not a Christian. I mean, she's maybe nominally an evangelical. but she's not a Christian. And someone commented on Dave Weigel's tweet. This a fellow named Jesse Curtis, who bills himself. Apparently, he's a professor of history, or history professor. And he said this. I thought this was an interesting comment too. He said, "The decline of Protestant supremacy, both as fact and ideology, is really something. Less than a century ago, this would have been front page news and major social tension. Now it's just quaint trivia." So, I mean, that's what's happened. I mean, the United States was, I think, 98% Protestant at its founding, and it was really the Protestant faith, the Calvinism of the people of the United States that gave the nation the shape that it has. But that's changed, and we've gotten to a position now where Protestants are pretty much, or to a very substantial degree, locked out of the top leadership jobs in the United States of America. And you have to ask yourself, well, what happened? How could that possibly happen? And I think to help answer that question, you can go and you can actually turn to the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah, he wrote this about Judah in his day. This is what he wrote, quote, "Your country is desolate. Your cities are burned with fire. Your land, strangers devour it in your presence, and it is desolate, is overthrown by strangers." End quote. Now, the people of Judah in Isaiah's day were experiencing the covenant curses that God had warned them about when they came into the promised land. You read that back, and I think it's in Deuteronomy, when they had crossed into the promised land, and God spelled out for them, blessings and curses. I mean, if you obey my word, if you follow the covenant that I've set forth for you, you're going to have all of these blessings. But if you don't do that, you're going to get all of these curses. And those curses were, they would become few in number, that they would become despised, that strangers would take over the land, that they would go into exile. Now, all of those things happened too, because of unbelief. Now, Isaiah, it was still about 100 years or so before maybe a little bit more than 100 years before all of those curses finally came fully to fruition. But the nation was already seeing it at that time. And the reason that they were experiencing that was unbelief. And I think that as Protestants, I mean, we can look at that in our own time and say, well, how is it that we find ourselves basically substantially dispossessed in the country that our forefathers founded? Well, it's because of unbelief. Same thing that happened to the people of Judah. I mean, I think you're seeing that happen to us in our own time. I mean, from the time that this country was founded until today, what is it? 200 and I guess almost 240 years now, over 240 years. So in that time, Protestants have turned their back on the Calvinist biblical faith of their forefathers, and have largely become unbelievers. I mean, it used to be in mainline Protestant churches, you could hear the gospel. And I'm speaking here as a Presbyterian. I'm a Presbyterian, so I can criticize Presbyterians a little bit more easily. The Presbyterian church I belong to, the Bible Presbyterian Church, is an offshoot of the old mainline Presbyterian church. And the reason the people left was because of the unfaithfulness, the unbelief, the liberalism of the mainline Presbyterian church. And this dates back to the 1930s and 1920s, and even really before that. The fight started in the late 19th century. Liberalism, versus biblical, the liberals versus the fundamentalists, as they used to frame that back in the day. And the liberals really gained control of the mainline Presbyterian church in the 1920s, and they really solidified that in the 1930s. One of the things that kind of marked the end of the fight was when they booted Mencken. Not Mencken. Machen. Excuse me, I'm confusing my people who when they kicked out John Gresham Machen from the Presbyterian Church, and then he went on. He founded the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, from that. And from the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, that's where the Bible Presbyterian Church came. But these groups, had to leave the mainline Presbyterian Church because it had become so corrupt. And of course, now today, instead of hearing the gospel in the mainline Presbyterian Church, what do you get? You get gay weddings. And in fact, I had a family member, some family members of mine. They, for a long time, attendees of a PCUSA. That's the old mainline, the biggest Presbyterian denomination in the United States. They attended the church there, and that entire congregation left the PCUSA here just within the last few years. The reason for that was over the whole same-sex marriage thing. The PCUSA embraced it. The church said, we don't want to go that way. And to their credit, they left. I'm glad that they did that. But, the PCUSA is still the biggest Presbyterian church in the United States. And when people think about Presbyterians, a lot of times that's what they think of. And you read the stuff in the paper and, they've got all this really obviously unbiblical stuff going on. And they think, well, all Presbyterians are like that. Well, they're not. I mean, there are still Presbyterians who actually do believe the Bible. And there are Presbyterian denominations that do teach the gospel of justification by belief alone. There are Presbyterian denominations that do uphold the infallibility and the inerrancy of Scripture. They do. There are faithful Presbyterians, but you're not going to read about them probably in the headlines of your newspaper, or maybe headlines on the internet now. I guess newspaper almost sounds kind of old-fashioned, doesn't it? Who reads newspapers anymore? Oh, but yeah, Protestants, they've abandoned the Bible as their source of knowledge about matters of salvation, and not only that, but they've also abandoned the Bible in matters of about politics and economics as well. And what I wanted to do was, I titled this episode, the Conservatism and Autopsy. Now, that particular title comes from an essay that was written by someone who has had a huge influence on my life. If you've watched my blog or listened to any of my podcasts, you've probably heard me talk about John Robbins, the late Dr. John Robbins. And, I think he was a truly extraordinary Christian and a wonderful teacher, and someone who has had a profound influence on my own thinking. And I started reading his work back around the year 2000. And the essay that I'm going to talk about here today, Conservatism and Autopsy, was an essay that he published in 2002. And I distinctly remember when I read that, and it had a very powerful impact on me. In fact, it was one of the very few things. I remember I sat down in front of my computer to read it, and after I'd read the article and I stood up, I was a different man. I had changed between the time I sat down and the time I stood up. It had that kind of an impact on me. And that was a permanent change. I mean, I've never gone back to thinking the same way I did before I read his essay, Conservatism and Autopsy. It really slammed home some truths that I was kind of getting at a little bit on my own, but this essay really put those together for me. And I wanted to share a little bit of what he said here. Now, I can't go over everything that he talks about in that essay just in our discussion here today, but I think we can at least talk some about it. Let me go ahead and get that here on the screen. Do a little screen share here. All right, so here's the Conservatism and Autopsy. And there's an editor's note. This particular essay was originally published in 1978, and then he went back and he republished it in 2002, and he actually expanded it a bit from the original publication. That's one of the things he talks about in the editor's note. Let me go ahead and just start here from the very first paragraph, and then we can kind of break it down a little bit. This is what John Robbins wrote, quote, "It is not the purpose of this essay to provoke an altercation with any conservative or with any Christian who believes that conservatism is good and ought to be defended. This essay is rather a recognition of an already existing state of hostilities between Christianity and conservatism. Hostility is initiated by the conservatives themselves. It may come as a surprise to some readers that there is a distinction between Christianity and conservatism, let alone a state of hostilities. And for that reason alone, this essay is necessary. Now, I remember when I first read those words, I just, wow, I've never seen anything like this. Now, one of the things that I learned from reading this essay, or maybe I should say this, just to kind of give you a little sense of my thought process leading up to this essay. I had really from my youth up, I'd always been someone who favored limited government, free market economics, and capitalism, those kinds of things. I didn't have a great philosophical grounding in them, but it always seemed to me that I've always been someone that favored freedom, favored liberty. And I remember I first kind of got a little bit more sophisticated in my thinking about that when I started reading Walter Williams. This was back in the early to mid 80s. He's an economist, actually just recently passed away. And I did a podcast on him about a month and a half back or so. Someone that really is an intellectual hero of mine and has been for many years and will continue to be. But I first started reading him, and he was a libertarian, and I love the way that he argued. He argued very systematically and very persuasively for limited government and for sound money, these types of things, for liberty, for capitalism, for political freedom. And I literally became a card-carrying member of the Libertarian Party for a while. And after a while, though, I started to get a little bit uncomfortable with libertarianism because I look at it and some of the conclusions that libertarians came to troubled me. Now, I wasn't a Christian at that time, but the libertarians, as you may be aware, they have this thing, most of them, the centerpiece of their philosophy is something they call the non-aggression principle. And the non-aggression principle, I don't have it here in front of me, but it states basically that you're not allowed to initiate violence against someone. And this is really the fundamental principle of their philosophy, is this non-aggression principle. Well, I mean, it leads to all sorts of things that I wasn't very comfortable with. I mean, it would, lead to things like, say, permitting abortion, for example. I mean, there are libertarian thinkers, major libertarian thinkers like Murray Rothbard, for example, who believe that you can justify abortion based upon that. You can justify all kinds of things like, say, same-sex marriage and open homosexuality as a result of that. You can do that, and that's all justifiable under libertarianism. And I just wasn't super comfortable with it. As I said, I wasn't a Christian, but those things troubled me. And so I started to look for something else, and I came across some of the writings of Bill Buckley, and in particular the National Review, and I started reading that. And this was a long time ago. I mean, this is maybe in the 1990s, and I became a conservative, or I was certainly very much influenced by conservative thinking. But over time, I started to get a bit uncomfortable with that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in time. But by the time I read this essay in 2002, I was at a point where I was just like, there's some things about conservatism that leave me troubled. And this essay, when I read it, Conservatism and Autopsy, it kind of gave one final last big shove to to my conservatism and kind of pushed it over the edge permanently. And sometimes I'll call myself a conservative. I think a lot of people would say I'm a conservative, but I really don't think of myself that way. I don't claim to be a conservative. And some of the reasons for that, I think, will become evident as we talk a little bit about this essay. So, we had this first paragraph here where, John Robbins talks about, he makes the point, that the conservatism and Christianity are not the same thing. And there's a state of hostility that exists between them. And that state of hostility was initiated by the conservatives themselves. And he goes on to talk in his essay. Let's go ahead and get that back up on the screen here. There we go. Okay, yeah, there we go. All right. So we got that essay back up on the screen, and he talks, the first sort of subsection here, he talks about conservatism as non-Christianity. And he says the trouble with conservatism is the same as the trouble with liberalism. It is not Christian. If one were to scrutinize the index of George H. Nash's classic, The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America, he would be hard-pressed to find even one Christian listed there. It is safe to say that of the 24 contributors to an anthology of conservative thought edited by William F. Buckley Jr., not one, including Buckley himself, is a Christian. Now, this is one of the things that kind of began to bother me about conservatism, and that is there weren't any Christians involved. I mean, you would read through it and you would find, Roman Catholics, you would find Jewish authors, you would find atheists, for example, but there weren't any Protestants. They weren't there. They just didn't exist. I kept asking myself, well, where are the Protestants? Where are these guys? Well, they didn't exist. And it was interesting to finally come along and to read what John Robbins said, and he says, yeah, they're not. I mean, these people are not. They're not Protestants. They're not Christians. They don't believe in. And when I say Christian, and John Robbins talks about this, he means that in one of two senses. He means either, number one, someone who is a genuine believer, that is, one who is justified by faith alone, through grace alone, through faith in Christ alone. Someone of that sort. I mean, that's the biblical gospel. We're justified by faith in Christ alone, and that faith is a gift of God's grace. Or someone who is maybe not a Christian, but inconsistently accepts the political and the economic ideas taught by Christianity. Now, Christianity has a distinct view on politics and economics. John Robbins, in another one of his books, in Ecclesiastical Megalomania, he talks about this. He called it constitutional capitalism. That is that the political view of the Bible is a constitutional republic. And the economic system of the Bible is capitalism, the system of free enterprise. And he called that complex the two, constitutional capitalism. That's the view of the politics and economics of the Bible. And of course, that's what we had at the foundation of the United States of America. We had a constitutional capitalist system. And there are people who are not Christians who actually do inconsistently accept that. And unfortunately, there are also Christians, and I think even people who are, I'm saying people who are genuine believers, who are really ignorant of what the Bible teaches on those subjects. And as a result, I think sometimes get pulled in one direction or another, kind of away from that, because they've never, ever had anyone teach them about what the Bible says about politics and economics. But one of the things I was coming to, and this was at a time when I became a Christian in 1996 at the age of 30. So I was reading Buckley. I was reading the Conservatives right about the same time that I became a Christian, and then after I became a Christian, I became even more and more concerned about some of the things that I was reading, and the fact that there weren't any Protestants. It didn't seem like who were major conservative theorists. That troubled me. Why is that? I said to myself. Well, we find in John Robbins' essay that it's because philosophically speaking, political conservatism is not only is not Christianity, but it's actually hostile to it. And the next sort of subsection in his essay here is called Conservatism as Anti-Christianity. He says, conservatism as a political movement displays as much variety of thought as liberalism, yet both liberalism and conservatism are united in their anti-Christianity. Both are tolerant, but neither will tolerate Christianity. It is a mistake to think that conservatism, as opposed to liberals and liberalism, are neutral on the issue of Christianity. There is and can be no neutrality. The conservatives seem to recognize this, but unfortunately, Christians do not. Many Christians still believe that politics is an endeavor that can be pursued shoulder to shoulder with conservatives. They believe that there's common ground upon which both Christians and conservatives can stand and build or rebuild a free society. So this is a serious problem. I asked before, a little while back, so how did we get here? How did we get to this situation where basically you've got the Democrats, the liberals, the progressives, the social justice warriors, the wokesters, all these people? How is it that they're running the entire country now? They say they're in power not just in government. They have the White House, they have the House of Representatives, they have the Senate. But it's not just that. I mean, they have all the major corporations, they have the schools, they have the universities, they have all of the media outlets, the newspapers, the TV stations. They have, all of the big tech companies out there in Silicon Valley. They're all woke. You've got the entertainment industry that's dominated by the wokesters. In Christians, it's almost like they don't even exist. How did we get to this point? Well, in one way, I mean, of course, large numbers of formerly faithful churches abandoned the gospel of Jesus Christ. They abandoned the Calvinism of the people who founded this country. But even beyond that, the faithful remnant, even people who are genuine believers have found themselves led astray and end up trying to pursue, building or rebuilding freedom in the United States with conservatives who are actually philosophically hostile to them. So instead of relying on the scriptures, they turn to these men who are very clearly people who are hostile to biblical Christianity. And John Robbins, he goes and he talks about this. He talks about some of the individuals and some of the really derogatory comments that they make about Christianity. And these individuals he talks about, people like, say, Eric Vogelin. Now, that may be a name that you're not familiar with, but he's a major conservative political theorist. And so what he says is something that has a tremendous amount of effect on the intellectual climate, on the conservative intellectual climate, and even on people who, like I say, who've never heard his name. That's one of the funny things about philosophy and about academics and scribblers, what have you, as some people call them. They can have an effect on people who've never even heard their name, but these ideas just kind of get out there. And Eric Vogelin is an example of this type of thing. One of the things that, and he quotes him, I'm just going to kind of paraphrase it, but John Robbins quotes him. He talks, this Vogelin fellow, he calls Calvin's Institutes a Gnostic Quran. I mean, I think that's a pretty derogatory way to refer to a man who did more to systemize biblical Christianity probably than anybody else, at least certainly in modern times. I mean, I think he's the greatest systematic theologian, or at least I think you could certainly argue that he is, of all time. It was John Calvin. And yet he refers to Calvin's Institutes, which is Calvin's main work of theology, as a Gnostic Quran, and he has nothing but contempt for it. And again, this is a major conservative theorist. One of the main points that John Robbins makes about the conservatives is he says that there is their denial of total depravity, and this is one of the ways in which the conservative movement, not just individual conservative writers, but the conservative movement, is actually hostile to Christianity. He says conservatives are fond of saying that they, unlike liberals, believe that man is depraved, that he is not by nature either good or perfectible. It is not enough to say that man is depraved, however, when one is discussing the relationship of Christianity to conservatism. The question is whether conservatives accept the biblical doctrine of man's depravity, and the answer is that they do not. This can be seen most clearly in two areas: epistemology and ethics. Okay, so I know everybody wants to just run away now. Oh no, he said epistemology. Epistemology, I know that can, if you haven't had philosophical training, that might sound like a pretty intimidating term. Basically, epistemology is simply is a branch of philosophy that answers the question, how do you know? When any of us, when we make a claim to knowledge, someone can always come and say, well, how do you know? I could say the sky is blue. And someone could say, well, Steve, how do you know that? And I could say, well, I look out the window and I see the sky is blue. Or I could say the grass is green. And someone would say, well, how do you know the grass is green? I could say, well, I'm looking out my window and I can see that the grass is green. So in a case like that, I'm appealing to sensory experience, and I'm saying that my senses, my eyesight, is the basis for my knowing the color of the sky and the color of the grass. And epistemology is simply, answers that question, how do you know? Now, I don't want to get deep into answer, to epistemology here today. That's not the point that I'm driving at here. But when it comes to answering that question, how do you know? Conservatives usually give an answer. They say, well, okay, we can come to knowledge by some combination of science, revelation, reason, tradition, and sensation. But Christianity teaches that we know what we know, not through any combination of science or revelation or reason and tradition, all these other things that the conservatives like to cite. As Christians, we say we know things because the Bible teaches them. Either they're expressly set down in the scriptures, or we can come to a logical conclusion based on the statements in the scriptures, the 66 books of the Bible. So in terms of how we know things, Christians and conservatives give very different answers to that question. And then there's also a matter of ethics. For instance, the conservatives tend to be natural law people. In other words, conservatives say, okay, you ask a conservative, how do you know right from wrong? And how do you know what the right thing to do is? And usually their cite, well, you can go out and observe nature, and you can derive, you can decide what to do or what not to do, or what we ought to do, what we ought not to do, based on an observation of nature. But that's really, and John Robbins makes this point in his essay, he says that's really a type of idolatry, because it's a sort of creature worship. But in Scripture, we're not told to worship the creature. That is, we're not to worship things that are created. We're to worship God. And for Christians, where do we get our ethics? How do we know what is right to do and what is wrong to do? How do we know what we ought to be doing or what we ought to avoid doing? Well, we know that by the law of God. And the law of God is summarized in the Ten Commandments. We don't look to nature to try to determine right and wrong. Nature's under a curse, right? When Adam and Eve fell, all of creation is under a curse. And there's a lot of things that go on in nature that are pretty terrible. Nature's red in tooth and claw, right? That's some people would say. And you can learn all kinds of terrible lessons by looking at nature. You can't determine what you ought to do by observing nature. But yet conservatives, the people that believe in natural law, and conservatives tend to be natural law people, will tell you that you can. And the Bible's teaching on what is right and wrong, well, that's ignored, or even at times it can be denigrated. Now, I say there's a lot in this essay that I can't cover here today. But what I did want to do is I wanted to focus and leave you with maybe a comment here from the end of the essay, because of course, as I said, we've gotten to a point here where Protestants have become almost, it seems like non-existent, a non-existent force in the running of this country. It was almost disappeared. And, what is to be done? Do we have any chance of preserving the freedoms that we still have? Do we have any chance of enhancing or expanding them? Well, if any of that is to happen, if we're to have any kind of a future at all, we have to get back to believing the things that the people who founded our country believe. We have to get back to the Calvinism of the people who founded our nation. And let me read. Here's a brief quote here from John Robbins. He says this, quote, "Conservatism has no ideology, no systematic thought, but the Christian system is Christianity, not the compromised Christianity of the Judeo-Christian tradition, or the superstitious Christianity of the medievalists, nor the irrational Christianity of the ersatz evangelicals and Romanist Reformed, but the clear, logical, and robust Christianity of the Reformation. The proclamation of that Christianity must begin with the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. What we call Western civilization, including the freedoms we still enjoy in the United States, is the product of the bold proclamation of the gospel in the 16th and 17th centuries. If the freedom we still possess is to be kept and enlarged, it can be done only if Christians clearly teach and the Holy Spirit makes many believe the gospel they hear. That is the way freedom emerged the first time, and that is the only way it can be maintained. To quote Whittaker Chambers in one of his more lucid moments, Political freedom, as the Western world has known it, is only a political reading of the Bible. But freedom is first a soteriological reading of the Bible, end quote. So I think, we live at a time right now, things look pretty grim. Things look pretty grim. We look around at the political situation and we see people who are, as Christians, we see people who are hostile to everything we believe, and they seem to run everything. And it can be intimidating, and you can almost feel like maybe everything is kind of slipping away. Now, ultimately, you and I mean, this world is not our home. As Christians, we know that, but that doesn't mean that what goes on here doesn't matter. I mean, it does, and I would much rather live, and I think most people would much rather live and see their children live in a country that was governed according to Christian principles than a country that was governed according to non-Christian principles. The fact of the matter is, most people in most of history have lived under oppressive governments. We here in the West have had a tremendous, extraordinary privilege of living under governments that are substantially influenced and formulated under the ideas of the Word of God. And if we're to preserve or enhance any of that, we're going to have to get back to preaching and believing the gospel of Jesus Christ. And not only just that, but also the whole counsel of God. In other words, we need to get back to being Protestants. And I'm afraid that we've gotten far away from that. And we're seeing the results of it every day all around us. Well, that's about all I had for this week. So I just wanted to say thanks so much for joining me for the podcast. For those of you who have been watching on the live stream, thanks for joining me for that as well. I hope to be able to do this at least once a week. I know I've been doing it on Friday nights up until now most weeks. I've been doing it on Saturdays here the last couple of weeks. I'm still trying to find out what works best with my schedule. But anyway, thanks so much for joining me, and I hope to be able to come up with maybe a regular day and a regular time at some point. If I do, or when I do, I should say, I'll let you know. Anyway, again, thanks so much for listening and for watching. I really appreciate that. I look forward to talking to you next time. Until that time, may the Spirit of truth guide you in all truth as you read and study God's Word. Goodbye.